Hey, this is episode number 63 of Gen X Amplified, and today, once again, it is all about generations and why we should not define any generation with just one broad stroke, especially the youngest generation currently in the workforce, and that would be Gen Z, because I will be having a conversation with Marcie Merriman, who is the America's Cultural Insights and Customer Strategy Leader for EY, also known as Ernest Young. And we will be unpacking the latest segmentation research Marcie and her team at EY conducted that highlights the true diversity of Gen Z, and also why it's important for business leaders, definitely including Gen X, to understand and embrace the differences and nuances within Gen Z in order to achieve business and personal success. So, are you ready? Let's do it.
The difference is Gen Z has had tools from birth, that allow them to learn at a rate that was absolutely inconceivable to millennials or other generations.
Welcome to Gen X Amplified, where we bring you inspirational and entertaining conversations with successful Gen X leaders and entrepreneurs.
This is the show created just for you. The powerful generation between the boomers and millennials to help you amplify your story,
maximize your impact,
and become Gen Exceptional in business and in life.
Now, here's your host, Adrian Porter.
Welcome to another episode of Gen X Amplified Live. This is the show dedicated to giving a voice to the very powerful generation between those brilliant boomers and those magnificent millennials. And always, thank you so much for listening, for watching, and for subscribing to the podcast. I truly, truly appreciate it. So let's get right into it. So I'm going to introduce my guest. So my guest is an internationally recognized leader in cultural anthropology and brand strategy. She currently serves as the America's Cultural Insights and Customer Strategy Leader for EY, also known as Ernest Young. Now, for over 25 years, she has been working with teams globally using human-centric strategies and insights to drive improved experiences, innovation, and growth across multiple consumer touchpoints. Now, what makes her so successful in this role is spending her life and career studying culture, society, people, and the change that is happening all around us. So without further ado, please welcome my Gen Exceptional guest who is continuously striving to help build a better working world, the wonderful Marcie Merriman. Marcie, what is going on?
Hey, how are you?
How are you? Glad for you to be here. Well, I joked earlier, I get to truly nerd out on generations.
You and me both.
Let's do this. So thank you for joining me. I am so honored for you to be here. First of all, how are you doing? How are you holding up? We're now again in this COVID-19 crisis. So first, how are you and your family holding up, and how are you getting through this moment?
Doing fantastic, doing really well, especially relative to, what so many other people are going through. And we're just plugging away.
Okay, I hear you. Where are you located?
Columbus, Ohio.
Columbus, Ohio, the Midwest. All right. Go Ohio. Awesome. So let's get right into it. So you and I talked a little bit before the official recording just about how we're holding up and our affinity for studying human behavior in generations. And obviously my lane is focused on with respect to stage of life, mid-career, midlife, and then majority of those individuals generationally are Gen Xers. You are very astute in all generations and stages of life, but you've been focused solely lately on youth culture, which I think is very, very critical for the world of work. But before we get into the work that you're doing with EY, can you just walk us and my watchers and listeners and even me through your personal fascinating journey along that yellow brick road that led you to the land of the gray and yellow at EY, if you don't mind?
Yeah, no, happy to.
Cool.
It's been an unconventional path, I would say. This is actually my second round with EY. I'm what we refer to as a boomerang. So I was with EY from 95 to 2001.
Okay.
was a leader in our consumer strategy practice out of New York at the time. But between these things, I've done a lot of other things. So I've had a couple stints in industry, working for Toys R Us, L Brands, Victoria's Secret, and the brand strategy side. Spent 13 years in startups. First one is a creative agency, a retail strategy design firm.
Okay.
And then I had my own company, which I started and actually sold to EY.
Wow.
So that's how I came back this time around.
Interesting.
So my fascination, as you said, is in understanding people and society and looking at these changes that are happening within it. And my education is in anthropology, sociology, so really combining these things. But I've always worked on the business side. So taking this perspective of looking at the world in a different way, but applying it against brand strategies, business strategies, opportunities. So it's really, where I found kind of that magic bridge is in tying these things together and not looking at it one way or the other, but trying to do both at the same time.
Interesting. So you mentioned brand strategy, and I have an affinity for brand. That's where I spent most of my professional career in marketing and brand strategy. But speaking of brand, you are a very unique brand in the world of the Big Four, and specifically, I'm sure at EY, because of your social science and anthropology background. And how have you leveraged that uniqueness, which is very valuable in this world when it comes to human behavior, consumer behavior, coupled with data and insights?
Yeah. Well, what I do with our clients and in our accounts and the work that we do is help, mostly working with C-suite and their direct reports, but helping them understand changes that are going on outside of their business. So what's happening from a consumer perspective or an employee perspective, but understanding them as a human being.
Got it.
So looking at all aspects of their life, how they live, how they shop, how they work, but really not just the behaviors, but looking at what drives them. What are the underlying instincts that they really wouldn't talk about on their own or even necessarily pull out, but understanding some of the motivations behind what they do. And then working with our clients to help anticipate what that can mean to their business. So some of the things that we're, looking at in society right now, we actually were before the COVID crisis, and, it's kind of accelerating and become even more important, are things around anxiety and distrust. And speed of change and authenticity. We can talk about a lot of these and how Gen Z actually drove them. But understanding those components of society and what are the implications back for businesses. So whether you're a consumer business trying to sell, toothpaste, or an automobile company, or even B2B businesses, understanding these types of shifts helps companies determine where they need to invest their time, their money, their resources against the future needs, and not just where they are today.
Interesting. You said that you were studying, and you and your team, obviously, the world of anxiety and distrust before the COVID crisis, which I'm sure now has been impacted even more, especially anxiety. And I talk a lot about anxiety when it comes to how not only our generation, Gen X, are handling that because of the world of work and with kids and just this sandwich phenomenon that we experience. But I definitely can see where the youth culture and the younger generations, where there's a heightened level of anxiety that wasn't there in the past, maybe when you and I were young, but it's just different. So you put COVID-19 on top of that, I'm sure that is definitely a highly has more impact on youth culture. So interesting. So you going back to your story, and then we're going to get right into some of the data. You said that you had your own company that you sold to EY, and that I'm assuming also was steeped in consumer insights and behavior. And obviously, a lot of the work that you were doing, then you're utilizing those skills, obviously, at EY today, right?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Exactly.
Yeah. So boomerang, full circle, right back to EY. So let's talk about the current work that you're doing at EY with respect to Gen Z, because this is very fascinating to me. Obviously, this show is Gen X Amplified, but we're going to make it Gen Z Amplified for today and amplify the unique behaviors and nuances of the younger generation. And when people think about the younger generation, a lot of times what's at the tip of the tongues are millennials, because obviously they're a huge behemoth generation at around 80 million strong. And then you have baby boomers, and then you have Gen Xers who are squeezed in the middle, and why this show is here. But then also you have this incoming influx of professionals at work, Gen Z, college students, and even middle school students, and people like my son, Cameron, who is 11. It's a very unique culture and generation that a lot of organizations are trying to understand. Mm-hmm. Obviously, because they're thinking about the future of work. They're thinking about how can I, as a business leader, be more effective as a leader? And I need to understand this young generation. What made you and your team want to look at this generation a little more closely? And then once we understand that, let's get into the most recent segmentation study that you and your team published, which I think is fascinating. And it's all about how when we think about Gen Z, we probably shouldn't think about them monolithically and in the same. There may be different nuances within that generation. So can you just talk about the motivation to study this generation a little bit more recently?
Yeah, funny enough, I mean, I'd say Gen Z found us rather than us finding them and discovering it. Because I had been doing a lot of research over, the last, 15 years now, at least, on millennials. So focused on youth culture, right? Okay. So my focus, although I certainly dig into boomers and Gen X and everything else, my focus has been on youth culture because I have focused on that as the driver of change. So whether it's social, things like new music, new technologies, whatever it is, the adoption of these things are usually based upon, the rest of us adopt it based upon what Gen Z has started. Right. So I look at that in order to give businesses an early indicator. They're the kind of the canary in the coal mine of what everyone else is going to expect down the line. Right. So that's why I've always focused. And millennials were that focus for all of us for 15 years or so. Right. And in doing the research on millennials, I was doing specifically a lot of work, probably about 10 years ago, on sustainability and environmental factors, because a lot of consumer businesses that I worked with wanted to understand what millennials valued. What are they willing to pay more for from a sustainability or, do good perspective? And what I started to see was very different between the older group I was studying and the younger ones. Okay. So there's kind of this division. So at the time, the younger ones were probably, looking at 9, 10, 11. And people were still thinking of those, which are now in their late teens, as being an extension of millennials. We hadn't distinguished them as something different. Right. But I found in the research something so different that we kind of knew that there was something going on. This isn't just an extension of millennials, but it's a group of people with their own attitudes, beliefs, behaviors that were radically different than millennials. And why I thought that was so important to dig into it is because of the clients and the companies I was working with. Mm-hmm. They're so focused on millennials. I was concerned they're going to miss what's come this next. Yes. This generation is very different. And some of the early things that we saw that were differences in views toward gender and inclusivity and wanting to be more independent and not wear, the logo, same shirt that everybody else is wearing. But fashion brands were still treating them as millennials, that same sort of mindset. Right. And this group was going to completely kick them in the butt because they had a very different view. And if they didn't know this was coming along, they couldn't anticipate the change, the shift, which would put them in the same position they were in for years with millennials, trying to figure them out. So it's really where it all started.
Interesting. So let's unpack that a little bit more. And obviously, in me studying generations, not only for fun but professionally, and focus on Gen X. But I always don't want to put Gen X so far in this bucket without understanding, obviously, the nuances of the other generations, because that's really helpful. But you're right, when a lot of times when Gen Z were starting to come of age or even get on the scene, there was this huge focus primarily on millennials. And I know, and I've been part of conversations where they would couple people that would now technically be classified as Gen Z right into the millennial conversation. And you're right, there's such a difference there. And from my studies and I use different data points. A lot of times I use Pew Research when it comes to cutoff dates. And again, I tell people all the time, it's not an exact science. Right. And you and I were joking before. People ask, well, how do I know if I'm a Gen X? And I said, well, if you grew up watching Mr. Rogers and after school specials and you went through high school without Google, you're probably a Gen Xer. So it give or take, but I use Pew Research a lot for cutoff data points. But for Gen Z, which have been defined from a few data points I've seen starting year 1997, because Pew cuts it off for millennials, the birth year at 96. And I've seen 97 all the way up through 2008. Then I see Gen Alpha. So I give or take. But anyway, to your point, I've noticed from not only my son, who is a Gen Z, and my daughter, who's probably an Alpha, from millennials that I know, that there is a difference. And is it when you start to see that, and I'm curious, even my own curiosity, is it because primarily a lot of Gen Zs were born of Gen X parents and Gen Xers have a different viewpoint than, let's say, boomers? Or does Gen Z have, in your studies, have found them to be the children of multiple generations, which is unique? Right. What's your take on that? Of number one, why is it that Gen Z are not synonymous with respect to behaviors and insights than when it comes to millennials?
Yeah. So many things go through my mind I want to jump into.
Let's do it. Let's jump right into it.
But first, with millennials, like where and why I think that they're so different than millennials. I mean, there's a lot of reasons. Okay. But one of the key factors I look at that I feel like doesn't get enough discussion is, one, it's the world that they grew up in. Okay. So our generations and people, which we put in the framework of generations, our attitudes, our beliefs, our things like this. The baseline things are certainly nuances, but our baseline kind of view on the world is formed during our formative years.
Correct.
So we point on society in our formative years, and our formative years are generally put anywhere between 12 and 22, which is where Gen Z is right now. So if you look at what happens in society and the impact of people in those years, that's where you can tie in kind of the generational or the implication component. Okay. So for Gen Z, think about that. The oldest of them was 2 when Columbine happened. Right. So they do not know a world where gun violence and actually school being the place where they consider themselves the greatest risk. Okay. I mean, consider that for, Gen X. School was, we might not have loved it, and there might have been a jerk in the class, but that was about the worst you were going to be dealing with, right? Right. Not somebody storming your school or people turning on you with guns.
That is true.
The oldest of them had just started kindergarten on 9/11. So they have never known a pre-9/11 world or a world that didn't have the threat of terrorism. That's their norm. They were in grade school when the recession hit. And with that, even as we've gone through this, bull market over the last, decade or so, they've still always had the mindset of when's the rug going to get pulled out from underneath them. Right. And these things happened, but then how society reacted to those things and the technology Gen Z had that was different than millennials is what I think made the real difference. So millennials, when 9/11 happened and they were, in their formative, where they were in their years, their parents still had the option to kind of protect them from these things. So whether it was gun violence, 9/11, 24/7 news, which had become rampant, their parents' reaction was to turn off the TV, to unplug the computer, which was still in the family room, so you could see everything that they're doing, and protect them. And it turned into a societal expectation. It turned into, don't let your kids play outside. Don't let them be by themselves. That became the societal norm. This is what a sign of a good parent is. A bad parent is somebody that lets them roam or figure out stuff for themselves or, get upset or whatever it is.
What we did, basically, right, as children.
What's that?
I said what we did as children.
Yeah. Millennial parents would be judged for doing what our parents did.
Right.
So it was just this switch.
Yeah.
But what happened with Gen Z is, there was a little bit of backlash, from society saying we can't be like, so much like this. But even more so, the technology that became available to them in the palm of their hand, really in mass starting in 2008, they had access to all of this. They knew about events in society before we did. We could not shelter them from them. So we couldn't protect them from predators on the internet. We couldn't protect them from hearing about, news of the latest terrorism thing, whatever it is. Right. They got the information. And with that, we started having more discussions with them, which really changed how society both parents them, raises them, but then also their role within society is a little bit different, a little bit more independent than what millennials, how the expectations of them were put out.
Wow, that was thank you, Marcie. That was some really great insight, because it helped me too. Because again, and I'm sure a lot of people that are watching and are listening and will listen when this is published as a podcast episode. That helps, because you're right. The way what happened during those formative years and currently does shape generations and people, and I truly believe that. That's why when I have conversations about generations, though it's not an exact science, I assure you that all of us that went through certain things during those formative years can be able to relate to each other as opposed to people that did not. And to your point, Gen Z, you think about the Columbine shooting, and the youngest were at the age of, or the oldest were at the age of 2 possibly. And then the recession of 2008 and 9/11, it's a different phenomenon than during the formative years of the millennials. And so let's get right into, speaking of that, and that was a great segue into this great study that was done on Gen Z by you and your team. Can you just talk about literally what was the premise, specific goal of the study, and who did you study? What were the sample size and data point? And then what were the key nuggets that came out of that great Gen Z segmentation study?
Yeah, no, happy to share that.
Great.
So this was a study in the U.S. We had 2,000 plus participants, enough to make it statistically significant and representative of the U.S. population. And what we wanted to understand, go at this from a couple different paths, is the nuances within the generation. Because first off, when people, including myself, I do it, talk about millennials, it drives me insane. Because they are the most diverse generation, group of people in history prior to Gen Z. They're the most diverse. They're now in very different life stages. So grouping this huge bucket of people into one group just isn't right in my book.
Agree.
So what we want to do with Gen Z is kind of cut it off at the pass. So before we start going down that road or continue down that road, wanted to dig in and say, okay, are they different? Do we see differences? But what really led me to really wanting to do it, other than not going down that same path, put them all in the same bucket, is through the research that we've been doing, both qualitative and quantitative. We've seen some really different attitudes and drivers and behaviors and that sort of thing come out from the group. So a lot of things that would really contradict one another, even within the generation. And when I see a lot of different people coming out and speaking on behalf of Gen Z, and a lot of them Gen Zs themselves, and they're giving a representation of the entire generation based upon their own personal beliefs. And that's one really important aspect to understand. But I wasn't convinced that one person's personal beliefs is representative of an entire population. So, and seeing differences, honestly, with my 16-year-old daughter, and hearing about their discussions around the lunch table at school. And she goes to an all-girls private school. So you'd think that they'd be a lot of the same type of group of people that end up being together. But I hear about the discussions about politics and their disagreement on multiple different things. And all of this said to me, this is not a homogeneous group. And in order to really get the most from them and understand, for whether it's consumer, employee, whatever it is, we need to understand their unique needs and not serve against a one-size-fits-all in order to kind of tally it up. And that's what led us to the segmentation study.
Oh, great. All right. So thank you for that. So not a homogeneous group, and the segmentation study, did it affirm that initial theory? And if that is the case, let's talk about some of those differences within the Gen Z population.
Sure. Yeah, I did. And then, there were a lot of surprises too. But there were some things that validated that there were unique differences. So we found 5 unique segments. And this is psychographic segmentation. So rather than looking at based on behavior, it's based on their attitudes, their motivation, the things that really drive them.
Got it.
And we found 5 groups. And the largest group is we've called stress drivers.
Stress drivers. Okay.
They're 35% of the population.
Wow.
And they represent what I see in a lot of, my daughter and her friends and a lot of my colleagues and their kids. And if we took it from just that perspective, we wouldn't realize this is only 35% of the population.
Okay.
But what we see in this group is a highly driven, want to excel, want to be the best, or worried about getting the jobs that they want. Their top concerns are three of their top concerns are financial. So things around being able to get a good job, being able to afford college, these types of things come ahead of it.
Okay.
But where we say stress drivers is they're so focused on success and achieving whatever it is they're supposed to hit that it's driving them to the point of the stress.
Okay.
I mean, one example within Gen Z as a whole is we see a reduction in use of alcohol, illegal drugs, things like this. Within this group, it was the Robert Woods Foundation did research within upper income groups, which this fell into.
Okay.
This is the one group that is not having a reduction of alcohol use, that they're actually more. And what they attribute it to is saying that it's because of the stress and the push and everything else. So that's where it's a deeper thing we need to dig into with each of them to really understand what's behind it, and not just what we see on the surface. The other group that is the most influential of Gen Z isn't necessarily the biggest. So the second biggest is big plans, low energy. We'll talk about them in a second.
Okay.
But the most influential is authentic activist, and they're 16%. Okay. So the others are roughly the same, the other four segments.
Okay.
And with authentic activists, that's when you think of Greta Thunberg, or the Parkland activists, after the massacre at their school. Right. You think of these young people, they have more charisma, ability to maintain themselves, like ideas, confidence, and conviction than we see in many adults. Okay. And they're driven by fear. Just as stress drivers are driven by fear of not succeeding, authentic activists are driven by fear of what will happen to the world if they don't do something. So it really is this existential crisis basis that's pushing them toward wanting to change things.
Okay. Wow. That was authentic activists, you said?
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. All right. And then, so stress drivers, authentic activists, and you said big plans, low energy was another one.
Big plans, low energy is an interesting group. Okay. So they were the second largest at 18%.
18. Okay.
Where they're interesting is when I first saw the data come out on them, I thought they would kind of be a throwaway segment, honestly, not be as important in whatever it is. Got it. But where I think that they actually turned out to be interesting is one, if we look at how millennials were stereotyped, right? The rap that they've taken for life, for being entitled, on and on. Pick all the horrible words you want to pick. Yes, yeah. My theory, now that I've seen big plans, low energy, is that there's probably a similar segment within millennials that is not representative of the entire generation, but somehow took on the meaning of what millennials are, and maybe it was a good media story, maybe whatever it is, but kind of took off with setting the tone for what millennials were expected to be or how they were treated. Got it. So the big plans, low energy is focused on success. Okay. They want to be successful. They want to make lots of money. Making lots of money is really super important to them. But unlike stress drivers or authentic activists, they're not taking the steps now to succeed later. So they're not worried necessarily about taking the advanced classes or making sure that they do all the right things to line up toward it. They just kind of think it's going to happen. Interesting. Yeah. Wow. And where they're important for all of us to understand, I think, and this is where the millennial tie comes back in, is we also looked at social media activity with the different groups or attitudes toward it. Right. And big plans, low energy is the most active in social media. Okay. But different than the other generations. The other generations were more focused on using it as a communication tool. It's not to say they're not going to post things on Instagram or whatever it is, but primarily it was about keeping in touch with friends, just exchanging messages, whatever it is, friends, family. Big plans, low energy was focused more so than the other groups on using it as the social peacocking, right? So who I am, what I'm doing, how great I am, these types of things. And where that's important is if companies are getting indicators of what their consumers think or want, or employees, based on social scans alone, or looking at what's being put in social media. If you're doing that with Gen Z, you probably gain a disproportionate share of views from big plans, low energy versus the other 4 segments.
Okay.
So these types of things are important drivers for business that they may not even be aware of.
Wow, that's very insightful. So that I got stress drivers, big plans, low energy, authentic activists, and then there's 2 more, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
the 2 others, carefree constituents, which basically go with the flow. Which can mean good or bad. So they may go either direction. And then, so authentic activists, stress drivers, big plans, low energy, carefree constituents, and secluded perfectionists. So the secluded perfectionists are focused on being the best at what they do, not necessarily to be viewed as successful by other people, not for the money. It's just that they purely love what they do, and they want to just, they're the people that live in the flow. They're doing what they love.
Right.
And the other thing that, demographically, we didn't see huge breakouts between them. All of these, the one exception or the exception is for secluded perfectionists and authentic activists. They skewed female, whereas big plans low energy skewed male.
Wow. That's low energy skewed male. I don't know how I should take that, but I'm not Gen Z anyway. I'm Gen X. So
yeah, there you go.
I'm just joking. So interesting. So I was going to ask you about the impact of social media on Gen Z holistically and then within these segments, because I'm curious, as you mentioned earlier, Gen Z has not known a world without information being available in the palm of their hands. Right. And social media has obviously played a huge impact in their upbringing. But you mentioned that big plans, low energy, that cohort was the most active on social, but not in the ways that the other cohorts were active, correct?
Right. Yeah, they're all active, but they were active in different ways. And Big Plans Low Energy was the one that would most often post things, not just trying to exchange messages, but posting things, talk about what they're doing or kind of promote what they're doing.
Wow, this is interesting. So, it's always great to have data just affirm kind of your initial theories, and especially when it comes to generational theory, where we should not, and I tell people all the time, whether it's Gen X or boomers or millennials, we should not paint everyone within a generation with a broad stroke. Right. There are different phenomenons and nuances and personalities and psychographics within every generation. However, holistically, we can look at some similarities. And so that's great because Gen Z is such a new generation, and the fact that you and your team were able to identify these different traits obviously is very helpful and instrumental for business leaders when they're looking at how they enhance their employer brand, how they attract the right talent, how they nurture the right talent, and not only with respect to talent branding, even consumer brand, how do they create the appropriate products and services for this particular generation, which I assume, if not already, will be a significant or one of the biggest spenders when it comes to economics in the near future. So it's very critical now. So thank you for my class on Gen Z and the different segments, stress drivers. And you're right. I remember when the unfortunate Parkland shooting happened, a lot of the activists and the loud voices that were amplified were obviously of this generation for obvious reasons. And I'm starting to notice that now. In conversations, I've also heard that the millennial generation are very activist, and especially when it comes to political activism and insights and just being out on the front lines. But you're noticing this continued trend, maybe in a different way. And it sounds like you have learned that and gleaned that from these data points. Yeah. So as we no, go ahead, please. You're about to.
Yeah, I was just saying, I think that the difference is, and you're right, millennials, a lot of things millennials started, Gen Z is just taken to the next level. So millennials raised awareness around environmental issues and these types of things. The difference is Gen Z has had tools from birth, that allow them to learn at a rate that was absolutely inconceivable to millennials or other generations.
Okay.
So one, they have the ability to learn, dig in, understand, find out information. Two, they know how to use the tools available to them, and they're not afraid to. Okay. So, for instance, after the Parkland shootings, many of the student activists weren't on Twitter at all. I mean, that was not their platform. That wasn't where, they hung out, did, communicate, whatever.
Right.
But what they learned very quickly is that's where the people they needed to reach hung out. So the politicians or whatever it was, that was the fastest way that they could raise awareness and reach those people.
Right.
And then Emma Gonzalez, one of the students there, I think it was within a week after the shooting, she had like 1 million followers. So they, are not they're not forcing themselves into their own tools. They're looking at where they need to go, what they need to do in order to succeed and reach the other people. Two, they're really masters of maximizing the potential and benefits of the tools. So they can learn how to apply it and go faster than anyone else. And that's where I think the difference is millennials may have had the same desires. They just didn't have the freedom, the tools, or the encouragement to really go out there and do it on their own.
Interesting. Well, speaking of maximizing tools, we're now in this current quarantined homeschool, work from home environment because of the COVID-19 crisis. You and I are, in our respective homes, and I've been working from home as well. And I have kids. I have a Gen Z and two Gen Z and maybe a Gen Alpha a daughter and a Gen Z son. And they're actually at home homeschooling. My daughter with respect to daycare, and my son is in 5th grade. And all of us within the past few weeks from all generations have had to adapt, or leverage the skill set that we've already had with these new technologies and tools because of COVID-19. Digging deeper into the insights of Gen Z, and let's couple that with this current crisis we're dealing with now. How do you feel this pandemic will shape how Gen Z will approach the world moving forward? Because we talked about formative years, and many of them now have been shaped again. And I talked about this prior to the recording. My son, who's in the 5th grade, will not have his 5th grade into middle school celebration that he's been looking forward to. Worse than that, the class of 2020, for those who are graduating this year, who are Gen Z, high school and maybe even college, majority of them possibly will not have any commencement activities. So that the impact of that on their psyche, I assume that it will be, whether it's negative or positive, I'm not sure, but it will have an impact. Based on your segmentation study, based on all the work that you've done throughout your life and currently at EY, what's your thoughts on COVID-19 and how will it affect not only Gen Z, but then let's just take a step deeper into maybe Gen Xers and our leadership and how we approach the working world?
Yeah. Well, it's how is it not going to affect us?
It's already
the bigger question. I think the biggest thing that I'm most concerned with is the anxiety and the stress.
Got it.
And this was something, especially with Gen Z. We saw it in broader population, but a Gen Z especially, we're feeling it very strongly before this even started. And this is one of the things that I get. I get annoyed with is the people who talk about Gen Z as if they're millennials and that we've been coddling them and this and that. And I'm like, no, we let go of that a while ago. These kids right today are not coddled. They're pushed to the absolute limit. And a lot of them are doing a lot more on their own. Okay. And on top of that, they're being pushed to do even more. And I think that that's what's driving a lot of the stress and the anxiety. And it shows in the factors. That's where this is not soft stuff. And the CDC reports that between 2007 and 2017, teen suicide rates went up by 56%.
Wow, 56. Oh, my God.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So these are not little things we can just look the other way and pretend, they'll grow out of it.
Right.
Serious stuff going on. And this is before the COVID crisis. So what kind of anxiety now are they piling up? And from what I've seen in our research and others, one, Gen Z is feeling much more anxious as a result of COVID than others. So they already went in more anxious, and they're saying their anxiety now is even higher than the other generations.
Okay.
What's interesting is that while they're very concerned with health concerns, it's not that these are off the radar. And they're just as high and maybe higher than the others, except for baby boomers. But their biggest concern is financial still.
Okay.
And financially, what's going to happen? How does this, push them back from where their goals were and what they already wanted to do? Mm-hmm. So I think out of this, one of the things that we've already seen that we're going to continue to see more of is a pragmatism. And pragmatism means not just how do I save money or get the best value, but how do I approach life in the way to set me up for success?
Interesting.
So in looking at jobs, I think they're going to be looking at more than just, okay, I'll get the 4-year degree, see where that leads me. Mm-hmm. I think they're going to be more analytical in it and saying, okay, what job do I want? How much can I make? What's a wise investment in the path there?
Okay.
And I think the COVID crisis has only accelerated that because it's taught the ability that we can learn from home. We can, do a lot without the structure of a school.
Right.
Are there better, faster ways to get to where different people want to be than the traditional approaches that we've known? Mm. So I think that that's one of the big changes we're going to see. But the other one that's tied to this, and I think is going to be huge for you next and everybody else, I hope, is the awareness of productivity versus time.
Okay.
So rather than judging people based upon putting in the 8 hours, whether it's school or work you and I do or whatever it is,
right.
It's going to be based much more on what did you achieve, what was the outcome, and I think we're going to more and more look at those types of things and realize we need to use our time, our resources, our money in different ways, mm-hmm. and look at the outcome of activities versus how long it took you to do it.
Wow, I totally agree, and I want to unpack that a little more because my wife and I were even joking and seriously talking about now because everyone's working from home, and even before this, a lot of companies that may have been resistant to kind of a work from home strategy or allowing their employees to work from home is that because you can't get any work done at home. Well, let's look at the data now. We're all been forced to do it, and so companies will have to adjust and be more embrace and be more welcoming to this work from home environment. But also because I think this is so critical, and obviously I speak to many individuals, my show and my brand and my professional focus as a consultant and speaker on Gen X and people in mid-career, especially at work, is that for many people that are in our generation that are leaders or managers or even work within the work structure that have Gen Z employees that are either coming in or are currently at the organization that still need to be reinforced and nurtured and up-leveled. This information is so helpful because, to your point, if there's a heightened level of anxiety within this generation, if there's a different viewpoint with respect to financial, how I'm handling finances and what type of work should I go after, mm-hmm. how can leaders in today's world of work and in the future of work use this information to become better leaders, to build stronger employer brands? And with that, that's working within the hiring structure. How can leaders also become better leaders internally, understanding these nuances and because of what has happened with COVID and with the data points that you guys have gleaned from the segmentation study?
Yeah, I think the first, it's kind of serious business. The idea of the anxiety and the mental, it's not going to be just anxiety. It's really going to be much more mental illness. Mm. And there's going to be more, I believe there's going to be more focus or as much focus on mental illness as physical illness. Because often it's the mental illness that's leading the physical, ending up in physical ailments. Mm-hmm. So I think as Gen X, as leaders and now leaders in organizations at this point, we need to look at it from that perspective of what is the cost to the business of this type of thing going on, and how do we proactively put programs in place to address it? Because I think until, I remember, probably in the 90s, late 90s, when I was first doing consulting, a lot of organizations were starting to put in programs to help people with their physical health, or to give them incentives, whether it's to quit smoking or lose weight, or whatever it was that they thought would physically make them healthier, better. It helps with insurance rates, but it also thinking, well, make them happier people, better, more productive employees. And I think the mental illness aspect of it now, which has until now been much more treated as something personal, private, you're not supposed to talk about, something's wrong with you, if you have it, whatever it is, companies are going to have to address it head on. But Gen Z also gives them the opportunity to do that, because Gen Z has been much more open in discussing things around mental illness and things that drive anxiety and the challenges. So like Gen X, our generation, that would have been seen as taboo.
Exactly.
We wouldn't have had these discussions.
Yes.
But Gen Z is ready to talk about it. So that's where it's going to be up to us to, they might not come to us proactively and say they want to do something about it, but it's where it's going to be up to us to have the discussions with them and understand what we can do to proactively put programs in place that are going to help.
Wow. I love this. And you're right. I remember starting my career in my middle 20s in the 90s, and when it came to health, it was all about having like the access to the gym at the office, which was really critical. But to your point, I think it's so important for hiring managers and business leaders to think about the anxiety and the mental illness, or the opportunity for mental illness when it comes to employees. And maybe that's altering your onboarding process or your interviewing process, or just inviting future employees to be more forthcoming with how are they feeling about certain things, or what are they looking for in a work environment. And I don't think we've done enough of that, but I think with this situation and with the advent of Gen Z will force us as leaders to be more mindful and empathetic when it comes to the mindset of individuals. Because as I always tout, I'm sure you know as well, to me, the most important brand asset for any organization is its talent, which creates the product and services. So I think being more aligned with those insights and understanding how anxiety, mental illness, and just their mental well-being is so critical to the success of an organization, which, to your point, it was so taboo back in the day. I mean, we didn't talk about it. If we were stressed out, we just came home and vented to whomever we were, or close friends or family, or you were encouraged to call the local or the companies, I can't remember the name, but the part of the organization in HR where you can talk to people about your problems. And it was very hidden. But now this has definitely caused us to elevate that conversation even more. This is so great. So just going back, I think for me, some of those key takeaways as leaders is that we should not look at this generation as a monolith. They're not all lazy. They're not all activists. And you mentioned something earlier about political, and this is definitely not a political show, a political conversation, but you hear some of the talk about as we go through time and as the generations get younger and younger, millennials and Gen Z, that I've seen data points that they're skewing. Everyone's becoming more liberal, and the older generations were more conservative. And with millennials, they were skewing more liberal. And now with Gen Z, they're all going to be liberal. Has the data underscored that, or have you seen that it's not necessarily more liberal than before? I'm just curious.
Yeah, no, that's one of the areas that I had seen from qualitative. That was a hypothesis I had, was that they reflected our society more so than past generations in their youth that have always tended to be more liberal in their youth, and then, maybe transition out of it or don't view it as harsh, strictly or whatever. But with Gen Z in this study, we asked them how they view their political beliefs. Okay. And it was, I think it was 38% said moderate, and it was 39%. And then it was evenly split on the other two sides between liberal and conservative. Yes. But what I think is really interesting with that, we saw this in some of our quantitative, and we've certainly seen it in our qualitative, is that what it means to be conservative to a Gen Z, what values that is, or what you support or what you don't support, is not a tick and tie against what it means for past generations. Okay. So as a Gen X, if you think about, moderate, or I'm sorry, conservative. It might be, specific things around gun violence or how we view environmentalism or whatever it is. Right. And Gen Z is not bucketing things into these neat little packages and, conservative is this or liberal is this, as past generations are. So they're claiming to be, kind of split on the two sides, but what that means, and the rest of us who, are in positions where we need to have that knowledge or use that knowledge, we shouldn't interpret it as meaning the same thing it has for us.
Interesting. Wow. I love to ask that question because we're in a political season right now. And I agree that anyone that not only is running a business, or especially if you're running for political office, you need to understand what your constituencies are thinking and the behaviors. And when Gen Z, that was an hypothesis that even I had, that as the younger they're getting, the more far removed they are from some of maybe the earlier conservative values and becoming more liberal. And it's interesting that at 30, you said 38 or 35% moderate?
Yeah, I think it's 38, 39% moderate.
That's actually a larger number than I would have thought before this conversation.
Yeah. Well, and that's where it's really important to dig into the data and understand it, because things like inclusivity or views toward gender or all these types of things, to them, those aren't necessarily liberal beliefs. Those are just human beliefs.
Exactly.
So that's where it's important for us to understand what that means.
Yes. Yeah. I love that. That's a great point. Well, this is so valuable. I can talk about this for hours. Seriously, just to nerd out on these generational conversations, but we don't have like 3 hours. We may have to do a part B. I'm not sure. But there is one question that I always ask all of my guests before we wrap up with Gen X Amplified, and I'm going to do this live right now. So are you ready, Marcie?
I'm ready.
All right. So Marcie, if there was a song that would play anytime you walk down the street or enter a room that perfectly fits you and your personal brand and your personality and the essence of Marcie Merriman, what song would that be? What would be your own personal theme song?
Yeah, this one, it would go back to this is going to be my Gen X roots. I'll show I'm a Gen Xer. It'd be Jesus Jones, Right Here, Right Now.
Wow, I love that. Right when you said I hear it, right here, right, I just hear it in my head. And tell us why.
Well, that was actually, I loved listening to that song when I was in college. It was one of the things that got me through, like the idea of what's going on in society and the changes. 'Cause, at that time when I was in college, we were having the Berlin Wall come down, fall of communism, Tiananmen Square, all these things were happening.
Right.
And I was getting to study culture and society and all of these things. And that was kind of, one of the big songs at the time, but it so represented everything and the idea that we were living in history. We were actually going through history and realizing it and realizing that the world was changing as a result of it.
Right.
And that is always happening. Like right now, I've had discussions with my daughter about we are living in history right now. And it's just crazy to be so aware that we know this is a historical moment, but we don't know how it's going to turn out.
That is true.
So that's why I love the song. It's always about at the moment. There's always something going on that we can learn about, and massive changes happening.
Wow. Well, I love that song. And I'm so glad you're right here, right now, talking to me about this great study that you guys have done. And I was fortunate to be able to, when you and your team published it, go through some of the data, but I wanted to reinforce for today. And for my listeners that are listening, for those of you who are, whether you're business leaders or entrepreneurs or incoming into the professional world, please think about these data points, because Gen Z, they're not going anywhere, and they will have a significant impact on not only our personal lives, on our professional lives. Many of us Gen Xers have Gen Zs that are little ones that are probably hanging on our shoulders right now, right here, right now, while we work from home. But Marcie, can you please tell everyone how they can keep in touch with you and all the great insights, both quantitative and qualitative, and the studies and all the great stuff that you have going on in your team that your team has going on?
Yeah, LinkedIn is really the best source where we continuously, I make sure it hits there. Okay. So our EY.com site as well. You can Google Gen Z or Google my name and find a lot of the information, but I try and make sure it all hits my LinkedIn so that people can get it when they want it.
Got to hear that. So make sure you follow Marcie on LinkedIn. And for those of you who are watching this live on LinkedIn right now, just go back and make sure you search up Marcie or click on the little name and you'll be able to follow her. Marcie, this has been such an honor. This is so great. Keep doing what you're doing. I'm a fan of the work that you and your team at EY are always doing. And it's not only helpful to me, but I think it will be helpful. I know it will be helpful for anyone that's looking to have an impact professionally. So thank you for joining me and spending time with me and our Gen X Amplified audience.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, that was such a fun conversation. Oh my God, I still hear that theme song in my head. Right here, right now. Okay, I'm not going to sing on this episode. I promise you that. I don't want to hurt your earbuds, but anyway, thank you so much, Marcie Merriman. Great conversation. And again, to remind all of you, she serves as the America's Cultural Insights and Customer Strategy Leader for EY, as we know as Ernest Young. And that was such an awesome and valuable conversation as she unpacked their segmentation research on Gen Z, which many of those individuals are the children of us Gen Xers. But it was such a great conversation because it's so imperative. It is so imperative and critical that all of us in the working world understand the nuances of every generation, but especially this young, vibrant generation in Gen Z that will help us do our jobs better and we can better serve them. So great conversation. Make sure you definitely go and check out the show notes and listen to this episode again on your favorite podcast platform. And also go to genxamplified.com and you can actually watch the actual interview and conversation since we filmed it on video. And while you're there, while you're at genxamplified.com, make sure you catch up on all the previous episodes featuring our great Gen Exceptional guest. And if you feel like it, if you love and gotten a lot of value from this podcast, give us a rating and review, a great rating and review at iTunes. So once again, thank you so much for listening, for tuning in. I truly appreciate it. And as I always say, remember, Gen X Amplified, this is more than a podcast. This is a movement. Thank you so much. Take care.